The GTX 1060 3GB card's existence is curious. It's one of these two. They look the same. They look the same even in the name. It's the GTX 1060, but it has one less SM. So in this regard, the change between the 1060 $200 card and the 1060 $250 card is actually somewhat significant. It's more than just a VRAM difference. What we've got is a 3GB card, that's the other one, a 3GB card, and this has 9 SMs. It's got 128 fewer CUDA cores, so instead of 1280, it's 1152. And then the 6GB card, which has 10 SMs and is running the full 1280 CUDA cores. NVIDIA is advertising a 5% performance drop in the GTX 1060 3GB despite its 10% decrease in SMs. The card also lists a $50 cheaper price than the 6GB GTX 1060, making it more directly competitive with the RX 484GB and parallel in marketing strategy, though the execution was a bit different. The curious part is why NVIDIA decided that this card should remain with the 1060 branding, but we'll talk about that after the benchmarks. Before getting to those, just a quick note to clear things up. We've seen some comments asking why this isn't a 4GB card instead of a 3GB card. Because of the way the GTX 1060 builds its memory subsystem, because of the 192-bit interface, it's not possible to run a 4GB solution on a GTX 1060. They would be different GPUs. Generally, when you see a multiple of 3, like a 6GB card, that card will only ship in other multiples of 3, like a 3GB card. The same is true for 4 and 8GB units. You'll never see a 4GB card with a 3GB alternative. It will always be 4GB or 2GB or 8 or something similar. For these tests, we're going to strictly cover the GTX 1060s. So that means other cards on the chart, normally like the 1080, 1070, RX 480, RX 470, none of those will be on these charts because we're just looking at these two, 3 versus 6GB. I'll throw that one in just to have it there. That is also GTX 1060. It's an overclocked 1060 by MSI, whereas these two are the stock clocks. So we are running a 1060 Founders Edition stock clock, 1708 megahertz boost versus an EVGA GTX 1060 3GB card, so it's 6 versus 3, also 1708 megahertz boost. Boost 3.0 has some variants, but this is as close to identical as we can get for the test. Memory clocks are the same, and we're really just looking at the FPS here, so there won't be a thermal comparison. It's not worth doing because there's no like for like GTX 1060s that we have to compare that would really see a difference in thermals from the VRAM difference and from the CUDA core difference. If you want to see the RX 480, 1070, 960, all the other cards, hit the link in the description below for the full article which contains the review and test methodology. Starting with GTA 5 at 1080p and very high and ultra settings, the GTX 1060 6GB card performs at 95 FPS average with 66.3 FPS and 60.7 FPS lows, trailed by the 1060 3GB card at 89.3 FPS average, 64.1% low, and 56.0.1% lows. At this resolution, the differences are largely inconsequential to gameplay, but are measurable. The performance difference is about 6.3% between the two, with the MSI 1060 Gaming X marginally ahead of these, a result of its higher clock rate. At 1440p, we're looking at 68 FPS average for the 6GB card, or about 63 FPS average for the 3GB card. The 0.1% lows are mostly the same between the two, and that remains the case for 4K, which is obviously too taxing for the 1060 anyway, but a worthwhile benchmark to see if any hidden failures are rooted out with a 3GB model. Shadow of Mordor produces more varied results. At 1080p, the GTX 1060 6GB card operates at 87.7 FPS average, with lows ranked at 68.7 and 66 FPS for the 0.1% low metrics. The 3GB card runs at 77 FPS average, a percent change of 13.5 from old to new, with the lows most noticeably different at 45 FPS versus 66 FPS on the 6GB card. That's a pretty big gap. Moving to 1440p, the trend continues and posts the GTX 1060 6GB card at 63 FPS average, 51.1% low, and 49.0.1% lows. The 3GB unit sustains 58.7 FPS average, 45.3% low, and 36.3 0.1% lows. A somewhat noticeable and significant difference at times depending on what's going on in the game. Assassin's Creed Syndicate was revived because it has historically shown us fairly large performance gaps between 4GB and 8GB or 4 and 2GB solutions like the RX 480, which in a 4GB model struggled in its lows when compared to the 8GB RX 480. In this benchmark though, we're seeing similar performance from each card. The 1060 6GB unit is slightly ahead and there's no game-breaking disparity between the two. Stutters are infrequent on both devices and lows are mostly identical. Opengl results with Doom are largely the same between the GTX 1060 3GB and 6GB cards. 1080p results are just under 100 FPS average, and the lows are fairly tightly timed for each. Vulkan testing does produce some screwy results though. The 6GB card vastly outperforms the 3GB card with Vulkan enabled, posting a 1080p performance difference of 26.5 FPS. That's huge, or 37%. At 1440p, we see similarly tied Opengl performance, both cards operating around 65 FPS more or less, which is then tanked for the 3GB unit with Vulkan. Vulkan positions the GTX 1060 3GB card at 50 FPS, with the 6GB FE card at 63 FPS. That's a difference of 13 FPS, or 27%. This difference only seems to exist with Vulkan for Doom, and because the cards still perform better with Opengl, you'd be best off taking that setup instead. Call of Duty Black Ops 3 is a title fairly sensitive to clock rate and VRAM changes, and we can normally rely on it to show swings between similar spec cards, but it sort of depends on what's going on under the hood and if there's any major pre-overclock. At 1080p, the GTX 1060 6GB card is performing at 122.7 FPS average, with the 3GB unit following at 113.7. That's a performance change of about 8%. The 1% low values are gapped by 10 FPS, with the 0.1% lows similarly spaced at 87 and 79 FPS. This maintains a performance difference in the low metrics of about 8 to 10%. 1440p posts slightly bigger scaling gaps with the 6GB card at 78 FPS average and the 3GB card at 71 FPS average. That's a 10% performance difference, or twice the 5% advertised by NVIDIA. 1% lows are also fairly gapped at 60.3 and 53.7 FPS. We tested a lot more games than this too. You can check the article link in the description below for Metro Last Light, The Division, and a couple of other games. So it mostly comes down to if the difference is actually noticeable in gameplay, and if so, is the $50 saved on the 3GB unit actually worth the performance drop? In most games from what we've tested, we're seeing about a 6 to 7% performance change from the 6GB down to the 3GB card. And in some games, like Doom with Vulkan, the changes are pretty massive, but in that scenario, you would be better off with Opengl anyway, and there are some sort of existing problems with Vulkan on NVIDIA with the new cards to begin with. So that's one of those scenarios where there is an alternative and it exists within Doom. You can go to Opengl, but when we look at the performance disparity between the two, it's pretty large, 27% in some 1440p tests, more than 30% in other tests. So it really comes down to the API at some level with Doom specifically. What we can't extrapolate is how does that impact these cards in the future, because these APIs, it's not just the developer pulls Vulkan off the shelf, puts it in their game, and it's done. They very specifically build for an API, so Doom could well be an outlier, but we just don't have a good way to know because Vulkan is still so new to the market. But we have the X12 tests and other tests in the article link in the description below if you want to read more specifically about the new APIs and their impact on these cards. As for the other games, like DX11 games especially, Black Ops 3 shows a difference of, in some cases, 10% at the high end for the performance change between 3 and 6GB cards, and that is, of course, accounting for the one less SM as well in the 3GB unit. And Shadow of Mordor shows a 14% change, which is pretty big, and the biggest for the DX11 games. The 3GB GTX 1060 is fine for some use cases, and there are only a few applications where its frames really dip hard, but when they do, it's pretty big and can be noticeable. That can be the difference of adding noticeable chop to 1440p gameplay in some instances if you're trying to use this for 1440p, because the GTX 1060 can actually handle that resolution, at least in its 6GB variant. With the ROM settings combination, the changes are particularly noticeable with that VRAM intensive application workload on the 3GB card. And going forward, we'd still recommend the 6GB GTX 1060 for most use cases. It's one of the only cards this generation available at its actual MSRP, near $250, and that makes it an agreeable purchase. This is a similar situation to the 4GB RX 480, which we generally would forego in favor of the 8GB model. That said, we did see some larger swings in the 4 versus 8GB RX 480 performance. As for naming, that's another matter. This isn't a lower VRAM GTX 1060, it's a different video card. An entire SM is disabled, including 1/10 of the card's processors, and it's half the VRAM capacity. The GTX 1060 3GB should absolutely not be called a GTX 1060. For consumers who are already faced with seemingly endless variants of AIB partner cards, X's and Z's and gamings and SC and SSC or FTW or Strix or classified and so on, this only further obfuscates the GTX 1060 pool. Further, it's not a GTX 1060, it's completely different in that one SM is disabled. So NVIDIA's choice to name the card as such will confuse buyers into thinking it's just a 1060 with half the VRAM, which is plainly false. This is a GTX 1050 Ti, and NVIDIA decided not to call it that. It's a marketing play. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. All these companies make marketing plays, and NVIDIA is certainly not alone in the video card market in that regard. But this isn't one that we can brush aside as harmless, because users will inevitably make the incorrect assumption that the only difference is VRAM. As for being VR ready, which I believe at least one of these boxes says on it, don't buy this for VR. The 3GB difference does matter there. A lot of VR applications are recommending 4GB or more of memory on the video card, which obviously a 3GB card does not fulfill that requirement or recommendation. And VR's got very tight tolerances, so looking at these 3D non-VR games, if we're losing 6 to 7% performance kind of at a low average, that amount of performance is a big deal in VR. And obviously scaling is a bit different there. There's dynamic settings, changes on the fly, all that stuff. But a couple percent is the difference between being able to play a game at a slightly higher setting or with greater fluidity in VR and not being able to do that, though we are still working on VR benchmarking, and that will come up in the future at some point, hopefully semi-soon. As for the 3GB GTX 1060, it has place in a few builds. So if you've got an odd budget distribution, the card does deserve to exist. I've seen some people say that it doesn't deserve to exist. I would say there is a place for the unit. I do take issue with the name, but as a product, $50 cheaper, it's okay where it is. If you've got a budget distribution that calls for a cheaper video card, maybe you want to invest the $50 in an SSD, but you're still building a budget system, or get a better power supply or something like that, it's okay there. But where possible, we would still recommend going for either a 6GB GTX 1060 or in applications where it makes sense, an RX 480 at 8GB. And you can check our 480 and our 1060 reviews for more discussion on those specific scenarios when you might want one or the other. But for 3GB versus 6GB, I would lean 6. 3 is okay in some specific budgets. So that's all for this time. As always, Patreon link, the post-roll video, link in the description below for more information. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.